Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are really embarking on an in-depth exploration, pulling back the layers on the origins and, well, the very foundational sources of Spiritist doctrine.
That's right. We've spent some time digging into a fair bit of source material for this conversation, and it really centers fundamentally around what's described as the absolute cornerstone text, the Spirit's book.
And our mission here, it isn't just a quick summary, It's more about understanding the why and the how behind the structure and the content of this doctrine.
Yeah, exactly.
We want to try and grasp the core elements, see its claimed historical connections, which are quite interesting, and examine the unique method reportedly used to build this body of work.
Mm-hmm.
And understand where it positions itself, within the grand arc of spiritual thought across human history.
And, understanding these foundations is, I think, more than just academic curiosity. It's actually pretty crucial for grasping the doctrine's presented depth.
Right.
And the framework of credibility it lays out for itself. It really shifts the perspective. It's not just about what the content says, but how that content was reportedly compiled, organized, and, importantly, validated.
Okay, so let's jump right in then. Where do these sources tell us this all begins? I assume with the book itself.
Precisely. The Spirit's book is consistently described as the fundamental text, the primary repository of the teachings of the spirits. That word, repository, it really suggests a deliberate collection, doesn't it? A storing of knowledge.
Like a vault, almost, yeah. A vault of spiritual wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
And the sources seem quite clear about the origin of the information contained within this repository.
They are, very clear. The core teachings within the Spirit's book were, according to the material we looked at, dictated by order of superior spirits. There's significant emphasis placed on this direct spiritual transmission.
Dictated by order. Okay.
Yes. And furthermore, the sources highlight what sounds like a rigorous quality control process. Nothing was included in the book that hasn't been reviewed by them. This implies a layer of authentication, by these same elevated spiritual intelligences.
So the content itself is presented as coming from the spiritual realm, specifically from these superior spirits.
Mm-hmm.
But the name everyone associates with Spiritism is Allan Kardec. So what then was his role in creating this foundational text if he wasn't originating the teachings himself?
Yeah, that's a really critical distinction the source material draws, and it's absolutely central to understanding the nature of the book. Kardec was explicitly not presented as the author of the core messages.
Okay.
Instead, his role is defined as that of an organizer. He was apparently tasked with systematizing themes and writing clearly. You could maybe think of him less like the author of a novel or, say, a philosophical treatise born solely from his own mind, and more like the editor and compiler of a monumental encyclopedia, perhaps, where the entries were provided by a multitude of highly intelligent, unseen contributors.
That analogy, an editor compiling contributions from unseen experts, that makes a lot of sense, actually. It clarifies that his particular genius lay in structure and presentation, not invention.
Exactly. The sources specifically list his direct contributions. They state that the order and methodological distribution, so the structure of the questions and answers, the notes, which often provide really helpful context or further explanation, and importantly, the style of writing, the clarity, the precision of the language used to convey some pretty complex ideas. These were Kardec's work. He took the communicated content, which presumably came in various forms, and gave it a logical framework, coherence, and, an accessible written style. But the foundational ideas themselves, they were transmitted to him.
Right. And who were these superior spirits then? The sources mention them as being of high elevation. Is there any more detail about their identities?
Well, the sources note that some lived on Earth, which, opens the possibility that these could be recognizable historical figures, maybe spiritual masters who continued their work from the other side.
Interesting.
But it's also stated quite clearly that others have no historical names. This suggests their identity isn't necessarily tied to a known earthly personality. What unites them, according to the material, is that their wisdom is evident in their messages. So the focus is placed squarely on the quality, the elevation, the ethical substance of the teachings themselves, rather than on specific names or biographies, particularly for those without earthly identifiers.
But, how can one be sure, or how does the doctrine itself address the question of surety that these complex, coherent messages received back in the mid-19th century were truly from elevated spiritual sources, external to the living individuals involved? How is that claim validated within its own framework?
And this is precisely where the method of assembly becomes not just interesting, but really crucial to the doctrine's claims of credibility. The sources make a point of stating that the mission was given to Kardec through several mediums.
Several mediums?
Yes, not just one. This wasn't a case of one person receiving messages alone in a room and writing a book.
Receiving messages through several mediums. That sounds like a deliberate choice, doesn't it? What's the significance there, according to the sources?
Well, it's presented as a kind of built-in mechanism for verification right from the very beginning. The idea is that if multiple individuals, often in different locations, maybe unknown to each other, operating independently, are receiving similar or complementary messages about the same fundamental themes and principles, well, that provides pretty powerful evidence that the source of these messages is external to any single medium.
Okay, I see.
It makes it significantly harder to attribute the content just to individual imagination or personal beliefs or even, potential unconscious biases.
So the multi-medium approach acts like a system of cross-referencing almost.
Yeah.
Before the information even gets to Kardec, the organizer.
Exactly, that's how it's framed. It aimed to establish legitimacy and consistency by demonstrating universality in the communications. This method, according to the sources, was absolutely fundamental to the entire process of compiling the Spirit's book. It reinforces the idea that the core teachings weren't subjective or isolated, but actually emanated from a coherent, collective source of spiritual intelligence.
So, for someone picking up the Spirit's book today, how does knowing this purported method of assembly, how does that shape their understanding or approach to the text itself?
Well, I think it fundamentally changes how you might perceive the book. It's not asking you to simply accept the philosophy of Allan Kardec, the man,
Right.
but rather to engage with what is presented as a collective revelation from the spiritual realm, which was then filtered, verified across multiple independent channels, and then logically organized by Kardec. Knowing this process implies a claim of rigor, of authority, aimed at ensuring fidelity to the original spiritual communications. And, when you're exploring significant philosophical or spiritual claims, understanding the methodology by which that knowledge was reportedly acquired and validated is, according to this framework anyway, pretty essential.
So it encourages you to look for that claimed consistency, the universality and the elevation of thought.
Exactly. Those are presented as the hallmarks of the superior spirit's wisdom. It encourages you to assess the content based on those internal claims of its origin and verification.
It definitely reframes the reading experience. It's less about studying one person's ideas and more about examining information presented as coming from a verified collective spiritual source.
Precisely. And this reported collective source and its teachings, they aren't presented in a vacuum either. The sources then take care to connect these ideas to something much larger, much older, weaving the doctrine into the fabric of human history and thought.
Which brings us nicely to the historical roots and precursors. The sources assert that Spiritism's ideas have, resonances with great thinkers from the past.
Yes, they make a very clear case that the principles presented by the spirits weren't entirely unprecedented in the mid-19th century. They frame Spiritism more as systematizing and clarifying ideas that have surfaced, perhaps in isolated or fragmented ways, throughout human history.
And who are some of the specific historical figures the sources point to as having connections, maybe echoes, of these ideas?
Well, the sources cite figures like Socrates, Plato is sometimes mentioned in related contexts, Fenelon and Benjamin Franklin are explicitly linked to Spiritist ideas in the material we reviewed.
Okay.
Now, the connection isn't necessarily that they were, Spiritists themselves in the modern sense of the word.
Of course not.
But rather that their philosophical concepts, or maybe even their personal beliefs, contain elements that align quite closely with core Spiritist principles.
Okay, let's take Socrates then. The source mentions he already spoke of the soul's immortality. How does that ancient Greek philosophical concept tie into Spiritist doctrine?
Well, the soul's immortality is, it's absolutely fundamental to Spiritism, isn't it? The entire basis for the possibility of communication between the living and discarnate spirits rests on the idea that the individual consciousness, the spirit, survives physical death.
Right, that makes sense.
So Socrates, grappling with the eternal nature of the soul in his dialogues, particularly around the time of his own death, was exploring a concept that is quite literally a cornerstone of the Spiritist worldview. His ancient philosophical inquiry into the soul's persistence millennia ago is presented as a significant historical echo, a precursor of a central Spiritist principle.
That's quite a powerful thread connecting ancient philosophy right through to this 19th century doctrine. What about Benjamin Franklin? The source calls his a curious case. Quite curious.
Well, he is presented as a particularly compelling example, mainly because of his famous epitaph, which he apparently wrote for himself. It reads, "The body of B. Franklin, printer, like the cover of an old book, its contents torn out and stripped of its lettering and gilding, lies here, food for worms."
Okay, a bit grim, but wait to the second part. "But the work shall not be lost, for it will, as he believed, appear once more in a new and more elegant edition, revised and corrected by the author."
In a new and more elegant edition, revised and corrected. Wow, that is a striking metaphor.
It really is, and the sources highlight this, interpreting it as a beautiful metaphor for reincarnation, which, as you know, is known in Spiritism usually as the plurality of existences. The idea that the work, the essence, the spirit of the individual is not lost, but reappears in a new edition, a new life, well, that resonates directly with this core doctrine.
And what about the part about being revised and corrected by the author, which he believed would happen? How does that connect? That's where the connection becomes even more explicit, according to the sources. Franklin's belief, as stated in the epitaph, that he would return improved as a result of inner work.
Right, inner work.
Is presented as aligning perfectly with the Spiritist view of reincarnation. It's not just seen as a cycle, but as a purposeful process of spiritual evolution and learning.
Okay.
Each new existence is viewed as an opportunity for the spirit to, well, revise its imperfections and correct its moral state through lived experiences and conscious inner effort. The sources we looked at explicitly state that's pure Spiritist doctrine.
Right.
And they add that this idea of returning improved through inner work is something reaffirmed by other illustrious names in history, suggesting that while Franklin's metaphor is particularly vivid, the underlying concept wasn't unique to him.
So, just to be clear, Spiritism isn't claiming to have invented concepts like soul immortality or reincarnation.
No, not at all. That's not the claim presented. The sources consistently frame the doctrine not as originating these ideas wholesale, but as something that systematizes ideas that have spanned centuries, often isolated or fragmented in different traditions and philosophies.
Right.
It's almost like discovering pieces of an ancient universal puzzle scattered across time and cultures, and Spiritism claims to provide the key, or at least a key, to assembling them into a coherent, rational picture.
Can you elaborate on this idea of systematization using another example from the sources, maybe reincarnation itself?
Yes, absolutely. The sources use the very concept of plurality of existences, or reincarnation, as a prime example of this systematization. They state that by teaching this principle, the spirits revive an ancient teaching.
Revive. So this implies the idea of multiple lives wasn't just confined to, say, philosophical musings or individual beliefs like Franklin's.
Exactly. According to the sources, it was a concept present in various forms quite widely in antiquity. They list specific examples. Pythagoras, the Greek philosopher and mathematician, the Druids, the priestly class in ancient Celtic cultures, and many ancient schools already spoke of it. This indicates that the idea wasn't just floating around. It was integrated into philosophical systems, religious practices, even mystery schools. The sources further assert that these principles appear in monuments, writings, and beliefs of various civilizations.
So widespread historical evidence.
That's the claim, suggesting humanity has long contemplated or even accepted some form of post-mortem existence leading to subsequent lives here on Earth. Spiritism, viewed from this perspective, didn't invent reincarnation, but rather provided a detailed explanation for its mechanism, its purpose, its justice, within a broader cosmic framework.
That significantly broadens the context, doesn't it? It paints a picture of the doctrine not as some sudden radical appearance of the 19th century, but as a structured continuation and perhaps clarification of long-standing human spiritual inquiry.
Precisely. And the list of historical figures linked in some way to Spiritist ideas extends beyond just philosophers and scientists like Franklin. The sources mention a really diverse group: Moses, Augustine, Luther, Diderot, Voltaire, Condorcet, Saint Simon, among others.
Wow, that's quite a range. Religious founders, church fathers, reformers, Enlightenment thinkers, even early social theorists. What possibly links figures as diverse as, say, Moses and Voltaire in this context? according to the sources.
Yeah, it's a broad spectrum. The connection isn't about them agreeing on everything, obviously.
Oh, of course.
But rather finding resonance on specific principles or perspectives that later form part of the Spiritist synthesis. For instance, the sources also include biblical figures cited specifically for spiritual manifestations. They name Elijah, Jeremiah, and other biblical figures known for receiving divine messages or interacting with the spiritual realm.
Ah, so connecting to the idea of spirit communication itself having ancient roots.
Exactly. This points to the idea that communication between the material and spiritual planes, which is a core aspect of Spiritist phenomena, is not presented as a new occurrence, but one documented even in ancient sacred texts.
So seeing these historical connections, it isn't just about, name-dropping famous figures. It's about demonstrating that the core concepts Spiritism discusses, the soul, life after death, spirit communication, reincarnation, have been part of human consciousness and inquiry across vastly different eras and cultural contexts.
That's certainly the argument presented in the source material. It aims to show the doctrine isn't some isolated modern creation, but draws upon a vast historical and philosophical heritage. It suggests that these fundamental questions have been persistent throughout humanity's search for truth. It lends a sense of continuity, presenting Spiritism as a coherent synthesis that brings together dispersed elements of ancient wisdom and modern spiritual manifestations.
It frames it less as a novel invention and more as, perhaps, an evolutionary step in understanding truths that have always been present, albeit maybe dimly perceived or misunderstood before.
That's a good way to put it. However, simply having historical parallels or echoes isn't sufficient on its own to establish the credibility of the specific teachings transmitted in the 19th century. And this is where the doctrine's claimed method for validating the spiritual communications themselves becomes absolutely paramount.
Right. Which brings us back to that crucial process of verification of teachings. How was this done, according to the sources, to try and ensure the information coming from the spiritual realm was reliable?
Okay, so the sources detail a method they refer to as the universal control of spirit teachings. This is presented as the primary mechanism for ensuring the authenticity and, crucially, the consistency of the messages received through various mediums.
Universal control, it sounds like a very deliberate and maybe challenging process, especially when dealing with unseen communicators. What did it actually involve in practice?
Well, fundamentally, it means that no single message and no single medium was considered the ultimate authority. For a principle or a teaching to be accepted as part of the codified doctrine, it had to be corroborated. Corroborated by multiple independent sources in the spiritual realm, communicating through different mediums, often in different locations, sometimes unknown to each other. The sources explain this by stating that similar messages came from different mediums even before the book's publication. This independent convergence of messages was the absolute key.
So if one medium received a message about, say, the nature of the soul, that message wasn't automatically included just based on that one instance. It had to be cross-referenced with others.
Oh, yes, precisely. The sources really stress that this provided a powerful method for verifying authenticity and consistency. Think about it. If the same, often complex and morally elevated concepts and explanations were being transmitted independently through various channels,
right,
mediums who might not know each other, might not be aware of each other's communications, it significantly strengthens the case, doesn't it? For the origin being a coherent external spiritual source, rather than just individual fantasy or subjective interpretation or even unconscious influence from the medium.
Was there a specific tool or platform used to facilitate this process? Collecting and comparing all these messages must have been a huge task.
Yes, there was. The sources highlight the Spiritist Review, the Revue Spirit in French, as a key tool in this very process. This was a journal founded and edited by Kardec, and it served as a place where spirit communications received through different mediums could be published. So it was used explicitly to collect those messages and validate doctrinal consistency.
So the review wasn't just like a magazine for believers. It was actually a critical part of the research and verification methodology.
Absolutely. That's how it's presented. It created a public and documented record where spirit messages from diverse sources could be gathered, compared, analyzed, and even debated. This platform allowed for the systematic application of rigorous criteria to determine which messages were consistent enough and of high enough moral and intellectual elevation to be considered part of the nascent doctrine.
And what were these rigorous criteria that Kardec applied? How did he decide what made the cut for the Spirits book, or what was considered doctrinally sound?
The sources are quite explicit here. They state very clearly that universality and agreement were required for a principle to be part of the doctrine. It wasn't just a casual comparison, it was a strict requirement.
Universality and agreement. Okay, let's unpack that. Universality meaning the message wasn't just received once, but by many different mediums in different places.
Correct. It had to demonstrate that kind of widespread independent appearance through diverse channels.
And agreement, meaning those different independent accounts had to largely converge on the underlying principle or explanation.
Exactly. There had to be agreement. Those independent accounts needed to show a significant degree of consistency in the core ideas, the explanations offered, and the moral principles being conveyed. This dual requirement, universality and agreement, acted as a robust filter.
A filter against what?
Against things like individual mediumistic error, potential fraud, which was a concern at the time, subjective biases creeping in, or even communications from less elevated, perhaps mischievous or unreliable spiritual entities. It was fundamentally a collective corroboration process.
It sounds almost like a scientific approach being applied to spiritual phenomena. You have a hypothesis, a message is received, you test it, does it appear elsewhere independently, and then validation, confirming universality and agreement.
That's certainly an analogy often drawn within the doctrine itself, presenting Spiritism as a kind of science of observation and verification applied to the spiritual realm. The sources emphasize the outcome of this meticulous process. It's presented as impressive how he organized everything with logic and coherence, ensuring the solidity of Spiritism. This methodology was consciously designed, it seems, to build a robust, internally consistent body of knowledge based on cross-reference spiritual input, minimizing the potential for single-source error or distortion.
In our modern world where we're just bombarded with information daily, and figuring out what's credible is a constant struggle. What's the relevance today of understanding this specific validation process used back then in the foundation of Spiritism?
I think it's incredibly relevant, actually. In an age flooded with information, claims, counterclaims, fake news, understanding the purported method of validation for any body of knowledge or doctrine is critical, isn't it? The sources here highlight a deliberate, documented effort to establish credibility for spiritual communications through a specific process that's verifiable, cross-referenced input. It's not asking for blind faith in one person's pronouncements, whether that's Kardec or any single medium.
Right.
Instead, it presents a method, the universal control by the spirits themselves, demonstrated through consistency across multiple mediums, documented via tools like the Spiritist Review as the basis for accepting the doctrine's principles. It invites a critical look at how these claims are supported within their own framework. And that critical lens, looking at methodology and validation, is a valuable tool to apply to information sources of all kinds today, I think.
It highlights a conscious effort to address the inherent challenge of reliability in spiritual communication, offering a specific, if maybe unconventional, solution.
Yes, it positions itself as a doctrine built not just on singular events or faith alone, but on what it claims is a body of consistent, cross-verified evidence received from the spiritual realm.
Okay, so we've explored the central text, the Spirit's Book, and its unique method of assembly. We've looked at the doctrine's claimed deep roots in historical thought, and we've examined this crucial process used for validation. Now, where does Spiritism place itself in the broader narrative of spiritual revelation throughout human history? Does it see itself as connected to other traditions?
Oh, absolutely. The sources make a significant claim about this. They reiterate that Spiritism didn't appear out of nowhere, but rather systematizes wisdom that has always been present in humanity. It very much sees itself as part of an ongoing divine plan, an unfolding of spiritual understanding for humankind.
So it's presented as a continuation then, not a completely new spiritual path that's disconnected from everything that came before.
Exactly, that's a key point. The sources explicitly state, "No great truth arises fully formed from a single mind. All truths had forerunners." This is presented as a fundamental principle here that spiritual understanding for humanity unfolds gradually, progressively.
Building on what came before.
Yes, building upon previous stages of revelation as humanity becomes ready, collectively, to receive deeper or more detailed truths.
And Spiritism sees itself as a key part of that unfolding process, perhaps the next step at that time.
Yes, precisely. The sources state that Spiritism proudly acknowledges those predecessors and continues the great spiritual revelation. It positions itself as the latest, or at least a subsequent, phase in this ongoing process, claiming to bring further clarification and systematization to truths that were previously fragmented, perhaps misunderstood, or even veiled in allegory.
And at the very heart of this entire progression, this great spiritual revelation, according to the sources, there's a central figure.
Absolutely. Unwaveringly, the sources place Christ firmly at the center of it all as the guide and model for humanity. This is really crucial to understand. While Spiritism presents new teachings, or rather new explanations and claims to clarify existing ones, it maintains a deep reverence for and connection to the figure and teachings of Christ. His moral code is viewed as the highest expression of divine law.
The sources seem to compare Spiritism's place in this chain of revelation to previous key moments in, well, Judeo-Christian history, specifically.
They do. They lay out a clear progression as they see it. First, you have Moses, who brought the revelation of the law. This represents a foundational stage, establishing fundamental divine laws and moral codes, particularly focused on the relationship between humanity and the divine, and also, importantly, social order.
Okay, the law. And following Moses.
Following Moses, Christ gave us the revelation of spiritual life. The sources explain how Christ built upon that previous revelation brought by Moses. It says, he preserved the eternal aspects of the old law, the core moral principles, and rejected the transitory, things like outdated rituals or societal rules specific to that time, while importantly adding new teachings about future life.
Focusing more on the spiritual aspect.
Exactly. Christ, from this perspective, elevated humanity's understanding beyond just adherence to external laws. He focused on internal moral transformation, on love, charity, forgiveness, and crucially, began revealing deeper truths about the soul's destiny and the reality of the spiritual realm.
Okay, so Moses brought the law. Christ brought the focus on spiritual life and love.
Yeah.
Where does Spiritism fit into this picture, then?
Right. This is where Spiritism makes its most significant claim regarding revelation. The sources introduce the concept that Christ himself, knowing humanity in his time was not yet ready to fully grasp all spiritual truths, actually announced the coming of a further guide or helper.
Okay.
They mention Christ announcing the Comforter, who would clarify what could not yet be understood in his time. This refers directly to promises found in the Gospel of John about the arrival of the Paraclete, the Spirit of Truth, who would guide disciples into all truth after Christ's physical departure.
The Comforter, the Spirit of Truth. And the assertion made by the Spiritist sources is that Spiritism is this promised comforter.
That is precisely the bold claim presented. Spiritism presents itself as that promised comforter, bringing answers to humanity's great questions. It's positioned not as a replacement for Christ's teachings, absolutely not, but as the promised continuation and clarification.
A continuation that provides.
That provides further detail, rational explanation, and supporting evidence through spirit communication for the spiritual realities Christ spoke of. Things like the nature of God, the destiny of the soul, the laws governing the universe, the reality of spiritual communication itself, the meaning of suffering, and the whole process of spiritual evolution through reincarnation.
So if Spiritism is presented as the work of this promised comforter, the nature of this revelation must be different from the previous ones, right? Moses and Christ were single embodied human emissaries.
Fundamentally different, yes. And the sources highlight this difference. Unlike those earlier revelations which had a single emissary, Moses, then Christ, this third revelation, the Comforter, has no single emissary. It's a collective revelation through the spirits.
A collective revelation.
Yes. This is presented as a key characteristic of the Comforter's arrival. It's not manifested in one single person appearing on earth. Instead, it's disseminated widely through spontaneous spiritual communication occurring across the globe, accessible to many.
That's a really important distinction. It implies a completely different way the spiritual realm is interacting with humanity to bring this stage of truth, not focused on one point, but diffuse.
Exactly. It's presented as a widespread, ongoing process of communication from countless spiritual intelligences, accessible through mediums globally, rather than being tied to one specific time, place, or human figure. This collective distributed source is seen as another aspect of its universality and perhaps a fulfillment of the promise that the Spirit of Truth would spread widely.
And is there a specific entity identified as presiding over or coordinating this vast collective communication?
Yes, the sources identify the Spirit of Truth, the very name Christ used for the Comforter, as the entity that presides over this work, this collective ongoing revelation. They note that many messages of high moral value, especially in the Gospel according to Spiritism, which is another key text focusing on the moral teachings of Christ explained through the lens of Spiritism, are attributed directly to him, to the Spirit of Truth.
And the Spirit of Truth is the name Christ used. That reinforces the claimed continuity.
It does. And furthermore, the sources make a rather profound observation about the nature and the tone of the messages received within Spiritism, particularly those considered to be from the highest sources. They state, the tone of those messages is clearly Christ-like.
Christ-like.
Yes. They elaborate, stating, even without an explicit statement, meaning even when a message isn't signed Christ, many scholars, presumably within the Spiritist tradition, see in them the voice of Christ himself.
So let me see if I understand this correctly. Even though the revelation is collective, coming through many spirits and mediums, and not through Christ physically reincarnated on earth, the guiding intelligence, the ethical essence, the spirit of the highest messages, is seen as directly aligned with or even emanating from Christ.
That is precisely the perspective presented in the sources. It suggests that Christ remains present, guiding us through Spiritist doctrine, not by being the sole communicator for every single message, of course, but by overseeing the entire work through these elevated spiritual intelligences, ensuring its core teachings are consistent with his own principles of love, charity, forgiveness, justice, and the path of spiritual progress. The collective nature doesn't diminish Christ's role. It shifts it to a higher, presiding, guiding function.
Okay, so the sources construct this narrative of spiritual revelation as an evolving process. It builds upon ancient wisdom found across cultures. It's significantly clarified and elevated by Christ's life and teachings, and now it's further expanded and detailed through what's claimed to be a collective, verifiable communication from the spiritual realm, the Comforter, all overseen by a Christ-like intelligence identified as the Spirit of Truth.
That's a very good summary of the comprehensive picture the source material presents. And, consider the power of this perspective for a moment. A spiritual revelation not confined to a single historical moment or person, but distributed globally, clarified across time by spiritual intelligences, explicitly building upon ancient human inquiry, and yet remaining centered on the figure and the moral legacy of Christ. It really makes you think, doesn't it? How does this idea of a collective comforter resonate, or perhaps challenge more traditional ideas about how divine or spiritual truth is revealed to humanity?
It certainly offers a unique lens, a different framework through which to view the relationship between spirituality, history, and ongoing human understanding.
Indeed it does.
So just to synthesize the ground we've covered in this deep dive, really bring it together. We've looked at the Spirit's book as the central repository, the foundational text containing teachings reportedly received from superior spirits. We highlighted Allan Kardec's vital role not as the originator of the content, but as the diligent organizer, the systematizer, the writer who gave structure, clarity, and methodological rigor to that communicated content.
Right. And we delved into the doctrine's claimed deep roots, examining how the sources connect Spiritist principles with the insights of historical thinkers like Socrates and Benjamin Franklin, and showed how core tenets, like the plurality of existences or reincarnation, are presented as reviving ancient teachings found across various civilizations. This illustrates that the doctrine positions itself as drawing upon a vast and long-standing human spiritual heritage.
I'd also explored the specific method claimed to be used to validate the spiritual communications, focusing on that concept of universal control of spirit teachings, the necessity of corroboration of messages across multiple independent mediums,
and the key role of the Spiritist Review as a practical tool for collecting and verifying these messages based on Kardec's rigorous criteria demanding both universality and agreement before a principle was accepted, a process aimed, according to the sources, at ensuring the doctrine's logical structure and coherence.
And finally, we position Spiritism within a specific history of spiritual revelation, as presented in the sources, seeing it as building upon the foundational law brought by Moses and the profound revelation of spiritual life given by Christ.
Yes, presenting itself as the promised comforter, a collective revelation, communicated through countless spirits but presided over by the Spirit of Truth, understood as continuing Christ's essential guidance for humanity's ongoing spiritual development.
It seems clear from the source material, then, that Spiritism presents itself not as some spontaneous, isolated belief system that just popped up in the 19th century.
No, definitely not.
But rather as a structured doctrine with a specific, documented method of assembly, claimed verifiable origins through this universal control, and a very conscious, explicit connection to the long history of human spiritual inquiry and the progression of divine revelation, particularly within that Judeo-Christian lineage.
It absolutely positions itself as a natural and necessary continuation, a clarification, and perhaps a rational systematization of wisdom that has, in its view, always been present, albeit sometimes fragmented, sometimes veiled in symbols or allegory in humanity's enduring search for purpose, for meaning, and for truth about life's deepest questions.
This understanding leads us to a final, maybe provocative thought for you, the listener, to consider as you reflect on all this material. The sources tell us, quote, "No great truth arises fully formed from a single mind. All truths had forerunners, and that Spiritism continues the great spiritual revelation." Now, if we accept this perspective just for the sake of reflection, the idea that spiritual understanding for humanity is an ongoing, evolving process with identifiable precursors and continuations, what might be the next stage?
Interesting question.
The next stage in humanity's collective understanding of spiritual life, potentially following the period described and systematized by Spiritism. And if the pattern holds, as the sources suggest, that hints or seeds of future truths are often present, maybe unrecognized, in the current stage, what signs or nascent ideas of that potential future revelation might we already be seeing or experiencing today? Perhaps building upon the historical foundations and the Spiritist synthesis we've discussed here.
That is a fascinating question to ponder, indeed, thinking about the ever-unfolding nature of truth and understanding.
Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the foundations and origins of Spiritist doctrine, based entirely on the provided source material.
Yes, and we genuinely hope this exploration encourages your own continued study, your own critical thinking, and reflection on these complex and undoubtedly profound concepts.
Until our next conversation on the deep dive.
Farewell for now.